There is a moment in every life that almost no one notices, not because it is hidden, not because it is extraordinary, but because it arrives dressed as something ordinary, a random morning, a quiet conversation, a single decision that feels too small to matter. Most people believe their lives change because of dramatic events. They wait for the breakthrough, the opportunity, the disaster, the miracle. They imagine transformation as something loud enough to shake the ground beneath them. But reality has never worked that way. Reality whispers. It never announces the moment your old identity begins to disappear. It simply watches. And while you're busy looking for the next big event, the person you've always been quietly starts fading into someone you've never met before. That's the strange thing about change. You don't feel it while it's happening. You only recognize it after you've become someone who can no longer return to who you were. Think about that for a second. Can you remember the exact day you stopped believing in something that once felt absolutely true? Can you remember the exact moment childhood disappeared? The exact second fear became normal? The exact conversation that convinced you to hide parts of yourself from the world? You probably can't, because the most permanent changes never happen all at once. They happen one invisible layer at a time, a thought, a habit, a reaction, another silent compromise, until one day, you wake up inside a personality you spent years constructing without ever realizing you were building it. That's what fascinates me. Human beings spend their entire lives trying to discover who they really are, yet almost nobody stops to ask a much more dangerous question. Who built the person I'm calling myself today? Was it really me? Or was it every expectation I accepted without questioning? Every fear I inherited? Every opinion I repeated? Every limitation I never challenged? Because identity is strange. People think it's something they possess, something permanent, something solid. But identity behaves more like water. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. Put it inside fear, and it becomes cautious. Place it inside ambition, and it becomes relentless. Surround it with doubt, and eventually it forgets confidence ever existed. The frightening part isn't that people change. The frightening part is how easily they change without noticing. You don't wake up one day deciding to become smaller. You become smaller after choosing comfort 1,000 times. You don't suddenly stop believing in impossible things. You simply stop questioning people who tell you what's realistic. You don't lose your imagination. You slowly replace curiosity with routine until your mind forgets how to wander beyond familiar territory. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just repetition, again, and again, until repetition becomes personality, then personality becomes identity, then identity becomes your prison. The strange part is, most prisons don't have walls, they have stories. Stories you repeat so often they begin to sound like facts. I'm just not confident. I've always been like this. This is who I am. Listen carefully to those sentences. Every one of them sounds final, as if growth has already ended, as if the future has already agreed to obey the past. But here's something I've observed. Your mind doesn't distinguish between reality and repetition. Tell yourself something enough times, and your nervous system starts organizing your behavior around it. Not because it's true, because it's familiar. Familiarity is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. People don't chase happiness as often as they chase familiarity, even when familiarity hurts them. That's why some people remain trapped in cycles they claim to hate. Not because escape is impossible, because uncertainty feels more dangerous than suffering. They've already learned to survive. Think about that. There are people who would rather remain exhausted than risk becoming someone they've never been, because certainty feels safer than possibility, even when certainty guarantees mediocrity. That realization changed the way I looked at the world. Successes stopped looking like talent. Failure stopped looking like bad luck. Everything began looking like accumulated patterns. Tiny decisions repeated long enough to create a destiny, not fate, parts, because patterns become predictions, wake up the same way, think the same thoughts, a rat the same way, avoid the same risks, protect the same fears. Eventually tomorrow has no choice except to resemble yesterday. People call it routine. I call it unconscious programming. The human brain is remarkably efficient. Once it recognizes a repeated behavior, it automates it. That sounds helpful, until you realize it also automates insecurity, self-doubt, overthinking, procrastination, fear. If repeated often enough, your brain eventually mistakes them for your personality. Imagine carrying a backpack since childhood. Every year, someone secretly places another stone inside it. One from a teacher, one from a parent, one from failure, one from embarrassment, one from comparison. Year after year, the weight increases, slowly enough that you never notice. Until one day, walking feels exhausting. You assume life became heavier. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you've simply forgotten what it feels like to walk without carrying things that were never yours. That's the tragedy. Most people spend decades strengthening the very burdens they're trying to escape, because familiarity convinces them those burdens are part of their identity. But they aren't. They're accumulated memory, conditioning, interpretation. Nothing more. Here's something that keeps returning to my mind. If every belief you've ever had was taught by someone, how many of your thoughts actually belong to you? Not inspired, not inherited, not copied. Yours. The question isn't comfortable because it forces you into unfamiliar territory, the territory where certainty disappears, where labels stop making sense, where you realize you've spent years defending ideas you never consciously chose. Most people avoid this place, not because it's dangerous, because it's empty, and emptiness terrifies the human mind. The mind would rather hold a false certainty than face an unanswered question. That's why noise has become addictive. Notifications, conversations, entertainment, constant information, anything to prevent silence from asking difficult questions. But silence has something noise never will. Accuracy. Silence removes distractions until only truth remains, not the truth you prefer. The truth that survives after every excuse disappears. That's why people fear being alone with their own thoughts. Because eventually, those thoughts stop entertaining. They begin revealing. They ask questions you've postponed for years. Who are you without achievement, without approval, without the opinions of strangers, without your past, without your fears? Strip everything away. What remains? Most people never stay long enough to find out. They leave before the answer arrives, because answers like these aren't spoken, they're experienced. There's an invisible difference between existing and being awake. Most people exist. Very few are awake. Existing means reacting automatically. Awareness means noticing the reaction before it controls you. That tiny gap changes everything, because inside that gap, choice is born. Without awareness, there is no freedom, only programming. Imagine someone insults you. You become angry instantly. Was that freedom or conditioning? Imagine failure appears. You immediately assume you're not capable. Was that logic or memory repeating itself? Every emotional reaction carries history inside it. History disguises itself as personality until awareness interrupts the cycle. That's when transformation begins. Not when circumstances improve. Not when life becomes easier. The moment you observe yourself without immediately believing every thought passing through your mind. That's an unusual skill, because the mind speaks constantly. But not every voice inside your head deserves authority. Some voices belong to fear. Some belong to old experiences. Some belong to people who disappeared years ago. Yet they continue speaking through you. Isn't that strange? Someone who no longer exists can still influence every decision you make, not because they're present, because their words became your internal dialogue. Once you notice that, everything changes because suddenly the voice isn't you anymore. It's just another sound, and sounds can be questioned, ignored, replaced, or allowed to disappear. That's the beginning of freedom, not becoming someone new, remembering that you were never the voice limiting you in the first place. The person you're capable of becoming has never been waiting somewhere in the future. They've been waiting underneath everything that convinced you to become smaller. And perhaps the greatest transformation isn't adding something you've been missing. Perhaps it's finally having the courage to remove everything that was never truly yours. The strangest part about awakening isn't what you discover, it's what you lose. People imagine growth as a process of gaining more knowledge, more confidence, more discipline, more clarity, but real transformation often feels like subtraction. The illusion disappears, the excuses disappear. The stories you've repeated for years begin collapsing under their own weight, and when they do, something unexpected happens. You realize how much of your life was being directed by things you never consciously chose. Not because you were weak, not because you lacked intelligence, but because every human being inherits invisible instructions before they ever learn how to question them. The world teaches you what to fear before it teaches you how to think. It teaches you what success looks like before asking whether success actually matters to you. It teaches you who to become before helping you discover who you are. And for a while, that system works. At least it appears to. You follow the map, you collect achievements, you reach goals. You build a life that looks impressive from the outside, yet something feels incomplete. Not broken, incomplete. Like reaching a destination only to realize it wasn't the place you truly wanted to go. Many people spend their entire lives ignoring that feeling. They distract themselves from it. They explain it away. They convince themselves everyone feels the same emptiness. Maybe they do, but normal doesn't mean healthy, and common doesn't mean correct. There comes a point where the discomfort becomes impossible to silence. A point where your soul starts asking questions your routine cannot answer. Why am I doing this? Who am I becoming? What am I sacrificing for the life I'm building? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, if nobody was watching, would I still choose this path? That question reveals everything, because it separates desire from performance, truth from image, purpose from approval. Most people never realize how much energy they spend performing confidence, performing success, performing certainty, performing happiness, not because they're dishonest, because they've forgotten the difference between who they are and who they've learned to present. Eventually, the performance becomes exhausting, not physically, existentially. You begin feeling tired in ways sleep cannot fix, because the exhaustion isn't coming from work, it's coming from misalignment, from carrying identities that no longer fit, from protecting versions of yourself you've already outgrown, and that's where the next stage begins. Not with action, with honesty, brutal honesty, the kind that doesn't negotiate, the kind that doesn't soften reality to protect your feelings, the kind that looks directly at your life and asks, what is actually true? Not what sounds good, not what should be true. What is true? Truth has a strange effect on the human mind. At first it feels uncomfortable, then liberating, then powerful, because once you see reality clearly, you stop wasting energy fighting it. You can finally work with it. Most suffering comes from resistance, resistance to change, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to endings, resistance to growth. We fight reality as if reality cares about our preferences. It doesn't. Reality simply responds to actions, consistently, impartially, every day, whether we're paying attention or not. That's why awareness is such a powerful advantage, because awareness lets you see consequences before they become circumstances. A small habit today becomes a future identity. A repeated thought becomes a future belief. A tolerated weakness becomes a future limitation. Everything compounds, not just money, not just success. Everything, the way you think compounds, the way you speak compounds, the way you treat yourself compounds, the standards you accept compound. Life is less like a lottery and more like an equation. The inputs eventually create predictable outputs. That's why extraordinary lives rarely emerge from extraordinary moments. They emerge from ordinary moments, repeated differently. One difficult decision, one uncomfortable conversation, one act of discipline, one refusal to settle, again and again, until consistency becomes momentum, and momentum becomes identity. Most people underestimate the power of a single day, because one day feels insignificant, but lives are built from days, not decades. You don't improve your life in 10 years, you improve today, then repeat it. 10 years simply reveals the result. That realization changed everything for me, because it removed the illusion of waiting, waiting for motivation, waiting for confidence, waiting for certainty, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Life doesn't reward waiting, it rewards participation. The future isn't something you enter, it's something you create through repetition. Every action casts a vote, every choice casts a vote, every response casts a vote. The question is, what are you voting for? The person you're becoming, or the person you're trying to leave behind? Because both identities are competing for influence every day, every morning, every decision, every excuse, every act of courage. The battle isn't happening outside you, it's happening within you, between comfort and growth, between certainty and possibility, between the familiar past and the unknown future. And here's the truth most people eventually discover. The future version of you is not waiting to be found. They are waiting to be built, piece by piece, choice by choice, moment by moment. No miracle arrives. No dramatic transformation suddenly appears. Just thousands of tiny decisions that eventually become impossible to ignore. Then one day, you look back, and something feels different. Not because the world changed, because you did. The fears that once controlled you no longer hold authority. The doubts that once felt permanent sound distant. The limitations you accepted as facts now look like temporary misunderstandings. And that's when you realize something extraordinary. You were never trapped. You were identified with the cage. The door was open much earlier than you thought. You simply didn't know it was there. Awareness revealed it. Courage walked through it. Discipline kept moving forward. And time transformed movement into reality. That's the hidden truth behind every meaningful transformation. No one becomes extraordinary overnight. They simply stop negotiating with the version of themselves that's afraid to grow. Eventually, that old version grows quieter, not because it disappears, because it loses authority. And that's enough. You don't need perfection. You don't need endless motivation. You don't need certainty about every step ahead. You only need enough courage to take the next step before you're fully ready, because readiness is often created through action, not before it. The people who change their lives aren't special. They simply make a decision most people postpone. A decision to stop waiting for permission, Bapasentrin, from circumstances, Bapasentrin from fear, Bapasentrin from other people, Bapasentrin from the past. They understand something profound. No future arrives on its own. Every future is built, and every identity is chosen, consciously or unconsciously, day by day, until one day you wake up and realize the person staring back from the mirror is no longer someone shaped by fear, habit, or expectation. It's someone shaped by intention, someone shaped by awareness, someone shaped by truth. And maybe that's what this entire journey was really about. Not becoming more, not proving anything, not outperforming everyone around you, but removing everything false until only what is real remains. Because beneath every fear, beneath every limitation, beneath every story you've been told about who you are, there has always been something waiting, quietly, not demanding attention, not asking for recognition, Just waiting for the moment you finally stop running from yourself. Waiting for the moment you stop looking outward for answers that were always meant to be found within. And when that moment arrives, when the noise fades, when the performance ends, when the excuses finally lose their voice, you discover something that changes everything. You were never becoming someone else. You were returning to the person you were before the world convinced you to be anything less.